All right. So far we've looked at blood pressure with regard to this, right? Taking into consideration that 120 is going to be your systolic blood pressure and 80 is going to be your diastolic. And we've looked at what's really going on in the heart during those two phases of blood pressure. What we want to really look at with this little mini lesson here is what's working to regulate it. It comes back to this idea of homeostasis, right? So, of all of the things that we regulate with regard to pH and glucose, blood pressure is right up there at the top of the list. So, as we've seen with a lot of things in the body, we're not only going to have one mechanism, but we're going to have multiple mechanisms in place to ensure that if blood pressure drops, if it rises, that we can really quickly fix that situation and get it back to where it needs to go. So when it comes to regulating blood pressure, I'm really going to focus on acute mechanisms here, meaning what tools do we have at our disposal in a short-term situation to help us lower blood pressure or raise it. I'm realizing my screen is covering up my board. Let's try that. Sorry, guys. Okay, so with acute regulation, you really want to think about our equation for blood pressure being cardiac output times total peripheral resistance. So we've got diameter that we can work with, and we have cardiac output that we can work with. With long-term regulation, you're bringing in the kidneys. So here you're really dealing with altering the blood volume. So that's really going to be saved for this next mini lesson that I'll post. So to highlight the key players here, it is essentially a reflex. And so you have to consider the receptors that are going to be responsible for picking up on those blood pressure changes in the first place. So if you pause and really think about where it's logical to have those receptors, you want to have them in places right out of the heart, right? So one of those is going to be in the aortic arch. So that's what you're seeing here. The others are going to be up in these carotid sinuses. And as you might guess, the ones going up to the carotid sinuses are making sure to protect blood supply to the brain. Those in the aortic arch are protecting blood supply to the rest of the body. You also can see that you're going to have some baro, right? Baro meaning pressure. Like you can think about a barometer. You're also going to have some in the arteries of the neck and the thorax. Another key player to think about here, again, a reflex, so the brainstem. So here it's the medulla that's really overseeing the changes in the cardiac output and the vessel diameter. So they're taking in all this input from the baroreceptors, from chemoreceptors in some places, and coordinating that. You see my note here about the higher brain centers. This is things such as anxiety, right? How is anxiety involved in increasing blood pressure? And so in the medulla, you have literally what are called the cardiac centers, and these are the cardio-acceleratory centers. I'll let you guess what those do. And then the cardio-inhibitory centers, which are going to slow your heart rate. And so the vasomotor center is going to send steady impulses through sympathetic efferent to our blood vessels. And so here we're really dealing with smooth muscle control around our vessels. So here we go, right? So here's our equation. Blood pressure equals cardiac output times total peripheral resistance. I really like blowing this out and thinking about the fact that cardiac output is also heart rate times your stroke volume. And I think when you think about it this way, it's just more tangible. It's easier to think about, okay, how can our heart rate change? How might our preload change? And certainly, how does our total peripheral resistance change? So before I show the next screen, let me just give you a situation to think about. Let's say your blood pressure goes up and you need to bring it back down. Short-term situation. So if this variable is too high, you want to lower it. So we can lower heart rate, potentially lower this, but this is going to be a much easier tool at our disposal. So if we're going to lower our total peripheral resistance, what might that look like in terms of vessel diameter, right? So are we going to be vasodilating or vasoconstricting? So just pause and think a second, right? So essentially what we're going to be doing is working to lower our heart rate to bring back blood pressure, and we're going to be working to vasodilate because we're trying to lower blood pressure to get it back to where it needs to go. So putting it all together, it looks like this. So if the first thing that happens is blood pressure increases, right? Our baroreceptors are going to pick up on that. They're just highlighting those carotid sinuses, aortic arch here. That's going to communicate to the medulla. And then here you see that we are going to slide this over here. We're going to stimulate the cardio-inhibitory center. So if we're stimulating a cardio-inhibitory center, this is literally just slowing the heart. And it's also going to inhibit the cardio-acceleratory center, also slowing the heart rate. In addition, we're inhibiting our vasomotor. So again, vaso, think vessel. Motor is just referring to the muscle that surrounds our vessels. So that's our smooth muscle. And so if it's inhibiting the smooth muscle, it's allowing it to vasodilate. If we vasodilate, we lower our resistance. And if we lower our resistance, right, we've got a bigger hose to pass water through. So there's going to be less pressure on that hose, on the walls of that hose. Same case with our vessels here. So we've got a lowered heart rate. You also see them noting lowered contractility. So that is actually bringing in that stroke volume piece. It's just not something I'm emphasizing as much here. And then here's our vasodilation where the vessels expand. So as a consequence of just of those major steps here, you get your cardiac output right back where it needs to go. And so a question I'd like to pose is this: are baroreceptors going to be effective with chronic blood pressure changes? So I think what I'm getting at here is if you are hypertensive, if you have high blood pressure, are these mechanisms still going to be effective? So I'd really encourage you just to pause a minute here. I've only got a little bit of time, so I'm going to keep going, but pause the recording, consider that. And the answer is going to be yes. So you have to think about these as being regulatory factors that control things from a minute-to-minute basis. And so it is the case that even if you have chronically high blood pressure, or maybe it's easier to think about if you have chronically low blood pressure, that you're still going to need to be able to keep homeostasis. The main thing that changes is these baroreceptors have a new set point. So they're going to be sensitive to higher levels of increase or lower levels if you have lower blood pressure. So these mechanisms are going to be really, really important for everybody. So if it helps you to bring everything together, this can be a nice picture. So you've got our blood pressure down here, mean arterial pressure is what they're considering. Here's our cardiac output, right? Times our total peripheral resistance. These are our variables that we know contribute to cardiac output, heart rate, stroke volume. And then over here, we've got the factors that are going to influence peripheral resistance. And so these these images are always showing directionality, right? So if we're working to increase blood pressure, then that's why they have these arrows pointing up. If you're trying to increase this, sure, you're going to increase your cardiac output, and you're going to do that by increasing your stroke volume and or heart rate. Over here, right, the total peripheral resistance side, we've talked about these three factors, right? So you've got blood viscosity, the stickiness of blood. We talked about EPO doping or dehydration are factors that came up here. Blood vessel length, right? You really don't have much control over that unless you grow or you build muscle mass or build adipose tissue. And then, right, really putting an emphasis on this factor here with diameter of these blood vessels. So I'm going to stop this little recording here, but hopefully that gives you a really